At 3 a.m. on Monday the 16th of April 1945, the final act of the drama that would see the demise of Hitler's Third Reich opened with a massive Russian artillery attack on the heavily defended hills, the Seelauer Höhen, overlooking the eastern approaches to Berlin. That evening, as I left the Drei Madel house, I stopped to watch the clouds above the horizon pulse, as if lit from within by violent lightning. At around midday on the 17th of April, a convoy of trucks arrived from the Lichterfelde barracks. We hurriedly packed our machine guns, ammunition and personal belongings onto them, and were soon speeding through the country lanes in warm sunshine. One of the youngest recruits, a boy with eyes as blue as flax flowers, wore a worried look on his face as he asked if we were heading for Berlin. "I think it's the Oder front for us a chance to put your training into practice," I replied. We joined the eastbound lane of the Berlin-Frankfurt Autobahn before heading south, through idyllic countryside, until we reached Bieskau, where an Oberscharführer was awaiting our arrival in front of a school. He ordered us to stack our personal belongings in a corner of the hall. "All documents are to be handed in, everything except your Soldbuch," he announced. "You must keep your Soldbuch with you at all times. If you are caught without it, you will be taken for a deserter and shot." We left the school and travelled, this time to the northeast, through Mulrose and towards the Oder River. Their faces as grey as potter's clay, a deathly silence had fallen over the recruits' no more hooray and Heil Hitler. The thought of confronting the brutal Bolshevik, an image burned into their brains, as they grew up on their own doorsteps, had chilled their blood. Now I dared to think that defeat was not only possible, but also inevitable. By late afternoon, our 12 machine gun crews were settling into prepared positions at the edge of a wood on top of a hill overlooking the Frankfurt-Mulrose road. Lichtenberg, a small village, lay a few kilometres to our rear. From the north, the ominous thunder of fierce artillery exchanges on the Seelauer Höhen continued as we set our machine guns on their mounts. Untersturmführer Schenk visited one machine gun position after the other, telling the crews the settings for the range and sweep of their weapons. Having adjusted and checked these on the 2 machine guns under my command, I reported to him, "Untersturmführer, our positions are ready." "Good, good," he answered with a slight tremble in his voice. "Tell me, I believe you were with Army Group South until 1943. What do you think we should do now?" "It might be wise to do a little research." "Meaning?" "Send out an intelligence-gathering patrol to get early warning of an attack." "Who do you suggest should do this?" As the only one present with first-hand knowledge of fighting the Russians, I volunteered. "I'll take 2 recruits with me. It will be useful experience for them." Armed with machine pistols, we made our way to an industrial building that lay in the distance. Although it appeared completely deserted, we approached it with the utmost caution and made our way to a door at the side. "Cover the entrance," I whispered to my young Kameraden. A sickly sweet smell caught my nostrils as I pushed open the door. I listened to the silence from within for half a minute before stepping inside to see wooden barrels stacked against every wall. A schnapps distillery. One of the recruits banged the side of a barrel with a clenched fist. "They're full," he said. "Should we take some back for our Kameraden?" "Just a little," I replied. The last thing I wanted was for the youngsters under my command drink to themselves silly, but a little treat might cheer them up. I kept a lookout while the 2 recruits found an empty pail of the sort used to store jam in these days. "Fill it, and then empty the barrels," I ordered. "Unterscharführer Bartmann, the schnapps must be worth thousands of marks. It seems a pity to throw it all away." "Don't argue with the Usha," scolded the other recruit. "I've heard refugees from East Prussia tell how the Russian hordes behave when they overrun our towns and villages. They go wild on plundered alcohol. Do you want your mother and sisters assaulted and murdered by the drunken thugs?" I moved along the rows of barrels, opening the taps as I went. The 2 youngsters followed my example, and soon the amber contents of every barrel was pissing onto the floor, forming expanding puddles whose advancing rims found their way to the drains. We returned to our lines with the pail of schnapps. I reported our findings to our youthful Untersturmführer, who seemed relieved to know that there was no imminent Russian attack. Under my advice, he ordered the liquor in the pail to be diluted before offering a single mouthful to anyone who wished it. Most of the recruits, little more than boys, had never drunk strong spirits before, and only a few of my squad took up this offer. As darkness approached, I poured the remainder of the schnapps onto the ground. Throughout that night, a heavy artillery bombardment shook the earth. Every young face bore the furrow lines of fear. "Don't worry," I assured them. "The detonations are too far away to do us any mischief. Ivan doesn't know we're here yet." "They're too close for comfort," exclaimed one of the recruits, whose shoulders yanked up tight at every whiz or bang. "How do you know?" piped up the recruit who had complained on the overnight march. "He's on an old hare, he can tell." I felt my lips pull an involuntary smile. It was strange, but nevertheless gratifying, to hear myself referred to as an old hare, though I was not yet 22 years old. Yet it was easy to understand the recruit's anxiety. I had felt the same tension when crossing the Dnieper under the protection of Unterscharführer Novotnik. "Settle down and get some sleep," I said, feeling almost fatherly. A depressingly grey dawn crept over the horizon, the signal for the start of a barrage of 15-centimetre Russian mortar shells that fell with frightening accuracy along our front line. No one could hear the screams of the wounded above the thud of continually exploding rounds. The land itself seemed to shake with fear. I popped my head above the line of the trench to make sure the Russian infantry had not crept up on us under the protection of the barrage. At that instant, a shell detonated close by, sending a gust of tiny slivers of steel blasting against my face. As I ducked back under cover, the recruits looked at me as if they had seen the devil himself. Only then did I notice the warm rivulets of blood trickling down my cheeks. Once again, my guardian angel was at my side. None of the little steel needles had found my eyes, and those that were embedded in my skin were easily plucked out. As the bombardment waned, German steel helmets appeared above the lines of our trenches. Someone close by was shouting, swearing, as he pointed in the direction of the Frankfurt-Mulrose Road. A squadron of Russian T-34 tanks was heading south. I raised my binoculars. The image that loomed into focus sickened me to the pit of my stomach. Women and children were bound to the tanks' guns. Though they were too distant for me to hear their wails above the sound of the tank engines, the body language of the mothers told its own pitiful tale. Cold, silent, helpless rage filled my heart. "What should we do?" yelled one my machine gun crew, his boyish face contorted by an expression of confused agony. One accidental pull on a trigger could have startled every one of our machine guns into unleashing a hail of bullets at the tanks, which were easily within range. "Hold fire," I said through gritted teeth. "Let the officers decide." After a short but heated discussion, the officers let the tanks pass without firing a single shot, but I dared not speculate the fate that might await the terrified hostages. We all knew of and believed the reports of Russian tanks deliberately squashing columns of refugees under their tracks as they fled East Prussia. Russian fighter planes swooped on our trenches, raking the area with machine gun fire. I made sure my recruits kept their heads down and we escaped the onslaught without a single casualty. By early afternoon, an enemy infantry battalion was gathering without hindrance just a kilometre away. "Don't worry about the bayonets," I told the youngsters of the machine gun crew whose trench I shared. "They won't get close enough to use them." Mutterings of anxiety continued to pass between the recruits as we waited for the inevitable onslaught. At last, the enemy infantry charged. Our machine guns unleashed a storm of bullets into their killing zone, scything through wave after wave of brown uniforms. The two crews directly under my command performed well, and we managed to hold back the attack on our sector of the defence line. My experience on the Ostfront enabled me to keep our losses to just 2 men. One of these we buried in the Friedhof in Lichtenberg. The other, a handsome young chap, I buried with the help of 2 Kameraden close to where he fell. The next Russian attack was more determined. They had found a gap in our lines, and Untersturmführer Gessner's infantry platoon left the cover of the woods to set off down the hill, ahead of our machine gun positions, with the aim of throwing back the enemy attack. Unfortunately, he took his unit too close to the enemy for us to give effective machine gun support. With the intention of fending off any assault on Gessner's squad, I led one of the crews down the hill to get a better firing position. Having covered about 500 meters, we came under intense small arms fire and threw ourselves to the ground. When the firing stopped, I was horrified to see a Russian infantry platoon close on Untersturmführer Gessner. He was on his knees with a pistol at his temple. There was a puff of smoke and he slumped to the side. His courage had not failed him. I pulled my machine gun crew back to our lines at the edge of the woods, only to find the other recruits exactly where I had left them. "If you had followed us, we could have saved Untersturmführer Gessner," I roared angrily, only to be confronted with an avalanche of excuses intended to justify their inaction. The night passed without further event. Ingeborg? I could hear the whistle of thrushes in the trees behind our silent machine guns, yet she came to me smiling. A dream had taken me under its wing. "One more time, Irvin. I wanted to see you just one more time." A great happiness came over me. We were in Friedrichshain Park, sitting on a bench by the Marschenbrunnen, hand in hand in the sunshine. Ingeborg's daughter sat on the low wall by the pool, her hand splashing the water. A tantalizing fragrance, a scent of summer, seemed to promise contentment. A voice broke into my happy illusion. Ingeborg stood and took her child's hand. "Goodbye, Irvin. May your guardian angel always be with you." I felt a hand grip my shoulder. "Unterscharführer Bartmann." I opened my eyes. "Untersturmführer Schenk," I mumbled groggily. The precious, illusory moments with Ingeborg melted into eternity. The feeling of happiness that had accompanied my dream gave way to a sickening melancholy. What do you think will happen next? I gathered my thoughts. They can't shift us with an infantry assault alone. They'll hit us with artillery or tanks as soon as they get organized, then their infantry will come at us again. As I swigged at my water bottle to freshen my dry mouth, the air whistled and the earth shuddered under the mighty thud of a large-caliber artillery shell exploding in the woods just behind our lines. "They're finding the range. Keep your heads down," I warned my young kameraden. Soon we were helpless under a hail of shells so intense the individual detonations merged into a continuous, deafening thunder. The air, reeking of burnt cordite, rasped at the back of my throat. Then silence, a moment of peace that was soon obliterated by the wild howling of Russian infantry. "Ura, ura," a chant from hell sung by vengeful devils. "God save us, there are thousands of them," a recruit exclaimed. Sounding like a gang of chainsaws working in a forest, our machine guns cut into the charging Russians, but still they closed on our lines. "Usha, the barrels are overheating. Keep firing." Wave upon wave of enemy infantry threw themselves against the storm of bullets that at last broke their attack. Amongst the heaps of Russian bodies, there were isolated movements and cries for help. Despite intermittent fire from our lines, the Russians made every effort to retrieve their wounded and dead comrades. At around 3 a.m. the following morning, the Führer's birthday, and a cold start to a wet day, the Russians attacked with renewed vigour, and on a wide front. Once more we inflicted heavy losses and managed to repel the attack. It would have been murderous chaos if they had managed to get amongst us while it was still dark. A second attack followed at about 6 a.m. 3 great swathes of brown uniforms, one behind the other, came at us as if in a scene from an old war film. The first row threw themselves to the ground. Behind them the second row knelt, and behind these stood the third row. The air around our attackers turned white with gunsmoke as each row fired, one after the other. We replied with a tempest of machine gun fire, the barrels of our weapons smoking as we emptied belt after belt of ammunition without pause. In the Russian ranks, men fell as if suddenly transfigured into rag dolls. Shells from the dreaded Ratchbums shrieked overhead, exploding close to our rear. With our machine guns now jamming with the heat of continuous firing, and the Russian infantry threatening to overrun our first line of defence, we spontaneously rose as one to scarper through the storm of shrapnel to our second line of defence, across ground that might erupt under our feet at any moment. At last we reached the relative security of our trenches, which, although shallower than those on the first line, were still intact. During a lull in the shelling, a Wehrmacht Feldwebel piled into my trench. With grunts and spits thrown in, he had invented his own novel expletives, which might be translated by, "The shitty bastards, the fucking fuckers have fucked off." "Who?" I asked. "The officers." Overcome with fury, I joined in the cursing. The shits, backboneless shits, I take recruits to witness the execution of deserters, and now they do this, the fucking arseholes. That's a bitter pill for them to swallow, hissed the Feldwebel. Now all that remained was a desperate band consisting of anyone able to handle a weapon, including abandoned Wehrmacht personnel, old men pressed into service as Volkssturm combatants, and boys of the Hitlerjugend determined to make a name for themselves. Words cannot describe that theatre of chaos. In an attempt to restore some sense of order, the few remaining Wehrmacht Feldwebels and I took command of the ragged survivors. Suddenly, though only an Unterscharführer, I found myself acting as company leader with the fate of about 80 men and boys in my hands. Throughout the night, the Russians pressed home an attack in heavy rain, but despite our inferior numbers and heavy losses, we managed to hold our ground. Sleeping was utterly impossible because of the continual skirmishing, and there was no food except for our meagre iron rations. Every one of us was close to the point of collapse. Then, as dawn broke, the bitterest news imaginable filtered through. A large concentration of Seydlitz troops, German soldiers who had deserted to the Russian side, was attacking our positions. Under constant fire, we pulled back to the third and last set of defence trenches. At about only a metre deep, they offered minimal cover but had foxholes positioned at intervals to offer extra protection. Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons were distributed as Russian dive bombers joined the attack. Bombs whistled to the earth, striking with frightening accuracy. As I cowered in my foxhole, the horrifying thought came to me that if a bomb struck nearby, I would be buried alive. Suddenly I relearned the art of prayer. At last, the bombers left the skies, but this was no respite from the fighting. The grunts of approaching tanks filled the lull in the cacophony of combat. I ventured a glimpse over the crest of my trench. A stand of birch at about 300 metres quivered as their silvery trunks groaned and splintered. A Joseph Stalin burst into view. With 122mm guns, these tanks, the heaviest in the Soviet armoury, could punch gaps in our defences through which their faster cousins, the T-34s, would rush. I grabbed my Panzerfaust, removed the safety pin from the trigger mechanism, and snapped the sighting lever into the upright firing position. Having only used this weapon twice in training, I was not at all confident that I would hit the approaching tank. Every beat of my heart sent blood hammering through my body. I lowered my head to align my eye with the 60-metre range slot on the sighting lever. The steel Leviathan was trundling straight towards me, the dry, high-pitched metallic squeaks from its tracks piercing the deep snorting of its engine. My thumb tightened on the trigger lever. I took a deep breath to calm my nerves and waited for the tank to come into range. A cloud of white smoke billowed from a foxhole about 50 metres to my left. Scheisse. A recruit had lost his nerve and fired his Panzerfaust too soon. The rocket swished through the air but landed 10 metres short. The steel monster came to a sudden halt, its engine revved hard, the gearbox grating as the panicking driver fumbled to engage reverse gear. Minutes later, the tank commander, his confidence restored by the arrival of several T-34s, resumed his advance on our lines, this time further to my left and out of range of my Panzerfaust. They were heading for the recruit, machine guns spitting a hail of fire. Flame flashed from the muzzles of the tank's guns. Shells exploded amidst our lines, creating unrestrained panic. When the tanks reached our shallow trenches, they turned to run their tracks along their length. Howls of agony rose up from German soldiers as the tanks crushed their bones. We left our wounded behind as we fled in ignominious terror. As I rushed through the woods, I came across the young Leibstandarte recruit with flax-blue eyes. He had pulled himself against a tree trunk with a leg it could no longer be considered his leg sticking out to the side at a horrifying angle. The top of the thigh bone and part of the pelvis was missing. His face ghostly white and glistening with beads of sweat, he raised his hand. Unterscharführer Bartmann, is that you? A faint smile of recognition passed over his bloodless lips. I knelt beside him. Nadja, mein Junge, it's Usha Bartmann. Unterscharführer Bartmann, he repeated in a steady voice. I have a request. Even before the words left his lips, I knew what the young man would ask of me. My stomach churned. Tears threatened to spill from the lower rims of his eyes as his young life ebbed away. Please, shoot me. My shaking fingers undid the button on my pistol holster. Steeling my nerves, I wrapped my hand around the butt of the weapon, but it was impossible to draw it free. Though it would have been an act of blessed mercy, I could not bring myself to kill the brave youngster. Around me, there was the rush of hunted men hurrying through the undergrowth. The last of our defence line was fleeing for their lives. I wiped the recruit's brow with a field dressing and left him leaning against the tree, praying he would die quietly from blood loss before the Russians came upon him. A handful of survivors from Regiment Volk and a few Wehrmacht Lancers latched onto me, pinning their hopes of survival on my experience. I led them to Briesen, a town served by a branch of the main Berlin-Frankfurt rail line, with the hope of catching a train to Berlin. As we marched, there were no soldiers' songs to raise our spirits. In every heart, the last smouldering hope of victory had flickered and died. Most of the men and boys under my command were from Berlin or its suburbs, and in their faces I saw a yearning to return home before war's brutal climax overwhelmed our once beautiful city. We arrived at the station to find the platform already packed with confused soldiers and refugees. It was a frightful scene. Mothers, their faces white with terror, held their daughters close, knowing they would see them assaulted before their helpless eyes should they fall into Russian hands. A Wehrmacht officer, freshly shaved and smelling of expensive soap, stood on the platform with 2 leather suitcases at his feet. Stuffed to bursting, they gave him something of the appearance of a rich holidaymaker. "Are the trains still running?" I asked. "I am told one is due any time now," he replied, looking down his long, aristocratic nose. I waited with my squad at the edge of the platform and stared down the track. Half an hour passed, and still there was no sign of a train. The longer we waited, I thought, the more tenuous would be our grasp on life. I gathered my ragtag troop together. "It won't be long till the Russians are on our heels," I said. "Those who wish to can stay here, the rest of us will head west." Not a single man in my squad chose to remain on the platform. We had covered only a few kilometers when we came across another mixed unit under the command of a Waffen-SS Sturmbannführer. Being of superior rank, he ordered my ramshackle unit back to the so-called front line, but at least he had the courage to lead us there, which I had discovered was more than could be said for most of the officers from the Wehrmacht. Confronted once more with the ominous sight of brown uniforms, the Sturmbannführer ordered us to make a stand at a line of vacant trenches. By good fortune, or so I thought, I came across an abandoned MG-42, a machine gun with an extremely high rate of fire. Beside it were stacked dozens of full ammunition boxes and an upturned helmet containing a signal pistol and several flares. Ahead, an open field offered little cover, an ideal situation for a machine gunner. It would be easy to halt the Russian infantry in their tracks. I yanked back the charging handle and squeezed the trigger. Nothing. I repositioned the ammunition belt, but the weapon refused to loose off more than single shots or brief salvos of perhaps 10 rounds. As I cursed the stubbornness of the weapon, the sound of foreign voices approaching from behind grabbed my attention. I glanced back to see a troop of Hungarians, young men, 17 or 18 years of age, equipped with nothing more than bolt-action carabiners and a handful of ammunition each. They knelt beside me and fumbled with their rifles. They didn't have a clue how to reload the magazines. I grabbed the nearest K98 and gave a rapid lesson in how to insert the bullet clips into the slot in front of the open bolt as the Russians closed on our position. The young Hungarians learned quickly and opened fire to good account. But there were large gaps in our lines, and a Russian platoon managed to work its way around our flank to where our Sturmbannführer and his men lay in shallow trenches. There was an exchange of grenades and fire from machine pistols, but the Sturmbannführer's position was rapidly overwhelmed. Now, as Unterscharführer, I was again the most senior rank present. Appreciating the threat of encirclement, I ordered the Hungarians to stem the Russian intrusion. They bravely drew their bayonets and threw themselves at the enemy, quickly succeeding in straightening our defensive line for a few vital minutes. The exchange of fire continued, but the Russians, growing in confidence, worked their way closer, crawling on their bellies with only their rucksacks visible through the long grass. After a few erratic bursts, my MG-42 failed completely. With cold sweat trickling down my back, I grabbed the signal pistol from the upturned helmet and fired. A red flame hissed at the tip of an arc of smoke that ended on a Russian rucksack. Squealing in panic, the rucksack's owner sprang to his feet, arms flailing as he tried to beat out the flames that threatened to engulf him. A volley of shots from my Hungarian friends put a speedy end to his struggles. Surprised by their setback, the Russians pulled back a few hundred meters, and I decided to withdraw my men while I still had that option. My intention was to head for the Berlin-Frankfurt Autobahn, in the hope that we would meet up with a viable fighting unit under competent leadership. As we approached the Autobahn, I saw a small group of Waffen-SS men ahead. Among them was an old Kamerad, Rottenführer Alfred Schneidereit. I quickened my pace when I saw the look of surprise on his face. As I drew closer, I noticed he now held the rank of Untersturmführer, and, between the lapels of his tunic, hung the coveted Knight's Cross. Despite his higher rank, we shook hands warmly. "Ah, Irvin," he sighed. "What a mess we're in now, a real mix-up. Nobody seems to know what the devil is going on. Not like the old days when we ran the Russians ragged all the way to Rostov. I see you've recovered well from that splinter you took at Prokhorovka." "And what's this, the Knight's Cross?" I remarked. A wide smile lit up his battle-blackened face. "Picked it up in December 1943 for taking out a tank or two. The Führer himself presented it." We talked a while longer before I set off once more to the west with my little band. With hunger gnawing at our stomachs, we came across several Wehrmacht soldiers standing guard at an ornate wrought-iron gate, the entrance to a rich country gut. I asked the Feldwebel in charge if he knew where we could get something to eat. "I can't help you," he replied. "You'll have to get written permission from the general if you want food." "Where is he?" "In the Guts house at the end of the driveway." When I tried to pass through the gate, the bayonets on the guards' rifles barred my way. "You can't go in there without a pass." It was a classic catch-22 situation, but after pleading with the Feldwebel, he eventually sent one of his men to obtain permission for me to enter the grounds of the estate. The guard returned after about 15 minutes. "You can see the general," he said, pointing a finger at me, "but your men must stay here." I walked as fast as my weary legs allowed along a tree-lined driveway until I reached the Guts house, where a pair of sentries guarding the door allowed me to enter without further questioning. Countless antlers decorated the oak-panelled walls of the Guts house's great hall, where a party of high-ranking officers sat at a long table warming snifters of cognac in the palms of their hands. As I marched up to them, a middle-aged general waved a cloud of cigar smoke from his face. "Yes, what is it?" "Herr General, my men and I have been without food for some time now. We urgently need provisions." "How many men do you have?" "About 20, Herr General," I replied. "Ah, 20. I don't think we could supply food for that many, but I can offer you something." "Why don't you join us, eat as much as you like?" said the general, stretching an inviting arm over the food-laden table. "No, thank you, Herr General," I replied. "As a Waffen-SS man, it would not be right for me to eat while my men went hungry." "But you must eat," insisted the general, his index finger wagging as if scolding a naughty child. "As leader, you must keep your strength up. How else would you have the energy to keep your wits about you and command your men effectively?" By this time I was becoming somewhat exasperated. What good would it be if I had a full stomach and my men were too weak to fight? I cast a deliberately malicious stare in his direction, and without waiting for dismissal, spun on my heels, muttering, "How could we ever win this war when we have leaders like that? I hope the Russians get hold of that bastard and he gets what he deserves." Perhaps my thoughts had been too busily engaged in thinking of food to pay much attention to the landscape, so I cannot say how far we walked in our state of abject hunger, but, as we passed a bullet-shattered barn, I stopped to sniff the air. "Roast pig." The words slavered from my lips involuntarily. "Wait in the barn," I said to my men. "I'll find out who's doing the cooking." A little farther on, I came across an army command post set up in a house a little way from the roadside. After negotiating my way past a myriad of sentries, I found myself in the makeshift office of a Wehrmacht general. "Ah," said the general, as if he didn't have a care in the world. "What is it I can do for you?" "Herr General, my men, they haven't eaten properly for several days." "Where are they?" In a nearby barn, I left them there to rest. And are they in good spirits? I briefly described our last few days to the general. I'll see what I can do. He took a pad from his desk and wrote out a pass. Take this to the field kitchen, present it to the cook. Salivating freely, I followed my nose to a large black contraption with 4 ovens and a central chimney, the field kitchen. The cook, like the general, was a jolly-looking man with a wonderfully round belly and cheeks as red as a ripe apple. He wiped his hands on his apron before taking the pass from my hand. "Ha, you're in luck, my friend," said the cook, snatching a dish towel from his shoulder. He bent to open the door of an oven and pulled out a roasted piglet on a large metal tray, placing it on top of the oven before handing me the dish towel to protect my hands. Desperate to eat, I had already turned to carry my prize to the barn when he called me back. "Hey, hang on a bit," he said, going to a second oven from which he conjured another tray, this time piled high with roast potatoes. I could hardly believe my famished eyes. With a large ladle, he transferred a generous heap of potatoes to the tray in my hands. "Don't bother bringing back the tray," he said. "I don't think we'll need it." In the dim light of the barn, every eye sparkled when I arrived with the bountiful tray of food. Involuntary grunts of delight burst from every mouth. We ate until our stomachs bulged and packed the remaining food to take onwards, keeping to the cover of forests as far as possible. I'm sure it wasn't long before that wonderful field kitchen became Soviet property. The wind breathed in sorry sighs. Cooing doves, calling to each other across the treetops, seemed to mock the folly of war. In the shelter of the forest, civilians and soldiers alike could escape the strafing by Russian planes that, apart from the occasional appearance of a few Messerschmitts, were free to roam the skies of Germany at will. A recruit walking by my side cupped a hand to his ear. "Unterscharführer, did you hear that?" I brought my squad to a halt to listen to the sounds. A faint metallic tinkling percolated between the trunks of the stout spruce trees. "Goat bells." "Voices too," said the recruit, and gunfire in the distance. I listened harder. The blast from the Tiger's gun back in Kharkov still dulled my hearing. I could hear women's voices. A track led to a clearing where a group of civilians had gathered with cows, sheep and goats they hoped to rescue. The women held onto each other as the sound of gunfire and the shouts of men crashing through the undergrowth drew closer. Suddenly, bullets smacked into the surrounding trees, throwing up clouds of scented conifer resin stray shots, but they sent the civilians scattering for cover. In the distance, figures in German uniforms dashed between the trees. They wore the white armbands that distinguished them as Seydlitz traitors. Soon the skirmish was over, and through the undergrowth, a group of high-ranking Wehrmacht officers and their entourage of dishevelled soldiers approached. Others guarded a few crestfallen Seydlitz troops they somehow managed to capture. One of the guards wore a red Egyptian fez and danced around the prisoners, cackling like a madman. An officer called out, "Hey you from the SS, you won't mind shooting this lot." "They're your prisoners," I called back scathingly. "I don't do that sort of work, why don't you shoot them yourself?" Hardly able to believe that I had spoken to a senior officer in such an abrupt tone, and not wishing to have any more to do with this bunch, I led my men away. When we were out of earshot of the Wehrmacht unit, one of the recruits, a smart lad, laughed. "Unterscharführer, it's lucky they didn't see your rank insignia, they might have had you shot for insubordination. But your soft cap does make you look like an officer." I decided to lead the remaining men in my troop to our old training ground at Alt-Hartmannsdorf, near Spreenhagen, where I hoped to find the remnants of Regiment Volk. When we were within a few kilometres of the village, an open-topped VW Kubelwagen at the head of a column of 3 trucks approached from behind. I brought my men to a halt at the side of the road to let them pass, but the Kubelwagen skidded to a halt as it came alongside. In the back seat was a Waffen-SS officer with 4 silver pips on his collar. "I'm Sturmbannführer Junghans," announced the officer. "Which unit are you with?" "Regiment Volk, Sturmbannführer," I replied. "We were at Lichtenberg when the Russians attacked." "Ah, Volk, my brother is in Volk. Look here. I'm in charge of a regiment of foreigners, Hungarians mostly. It would be good to have German voices around me again. You and your men could join my unit, act as my bodyguard." Despite his high rank, his words sounded more like an offer than an order. Ja, of course, I replied without a second thought. My recruits crushed into a truck while I joined Jungens in the Kubelwagen. I've set up my command post in a cellar of a farmhouse close to Spreenhagen, said Jungens in a friendly tone as we bumped along the country road. When we arrive, I would like you to form your men into a guard detail, then report to my office. My spirits lifted by the prospect of having an experienced officer to rely upon, I enthusiastically replied, Jawohl, Sturmbannführer. When I called into his office, Jungens handed me an envelope saying, Here, read the papers inside and sign them. I glanced through the papers briefly, noticing that Jungens sometimes went under the name of Obersturmbannführer Hengstmann. I thought it strange that a man should have two names, each with different ranks and dates of birth, but made no comment to him at the time. I signed at the bottom of each of the pages and returned them to my new commanding officer. The following day, I travelled with Jungens in the back seat of his Kubelwagen on a tour of inspection of our defensive positions, and having got to know him a little better, felt I could speak freely to him. Sturmbannführer, how did it happen that you have two names? If you had read my papers more carefully, you would understand, he replied with a secretive smile. He reached inside his camouflage jacket. Here, have another look, he said, handing me the envelope. And by the way, if it looks like the Russians have a chance to grab me, I want you to shoot me. From now on, these papers stay with you. If anything happens to me, you must burn them so that not a trace remains. When the opportunity presented itself, I read the documents carefully and learned that, before the war, Jungens had been an espionage agent in Russia for 7 years and had lived in South America and spoke 7 languages. There were other details of his life that after nearly 70 years, I cannot now remember. A little farther on, we stopped at a command post set up in a house. I followed Jungens past the guards at the door and down a short flight of stairs to a cellar where we found Obersturmbannführer Rosenbusch sitting at a table with his head in his hands. In the background, lesser officers were artificially engrossed in shuffling papers around their desks. Evidently, Rosenbusch no longer had the imagination to believe in our ultimate victory, nor the composure to mask his doubts. I can't go on, he sobbed. This is the end. We are all going to die. Although apparently inferior in rank, Jungens grabbed the collar of Rosenbusch's tunic with both hands, yanking him to his feet. His face contorted by contempt, he snarled, Look at you. You're a disgrace, snivelling like a stupid little girl. We all die. It's how we live that counts. Honour and loyalty, we live by these things. Why are you not with your men? Rosenbusch turned his face from the storm of saliva droplets spewing from Jungens' mouth. I came back here to coordinate our defence. Everything is out of control. There's nothing I can do. We're finished. Jungens pulled Rosenbusch closer until their foreheads pressed hard against each other. Get back to your men, he snarled. Show them respect. Keep your fears to yourself and show them courage. Suddenly, he flung the trembling Obersturmbannführer back into his chair. Bastard, I should shoot you right now. Our route back to Jungens' command post took us through Markgrafieska, where white sheets hung from the windows of the scattered houses. There was the crackle of rifle fire, and some shots kicked up the dirt close to our Kubelwagen. Obersturmbannführer, I know another way to Spreenhagen through Spreo, I yelled above the revving engine. We should take the next turning. As the driver swung the Kubelwagen into a country lane, a few bullets pattered through the bodywork of our vehicle without, fortunately, damaging the fuel tank or tyres. Travelling the back roads, we came to the outskirts of Spreo, where a grey-haired man wearing a waistcoat waved at our approach. Jungens tapped the driver on the shoulder. Pull up, let's hear what he has to say. There was a look of despair on the old man's face. The Bolsheviks are in some of the houses already, he explained. I thought I would get out while I could. Watch out, don't go over there, he said, pointing to a house off to the side of the main road. The owner of that farm is luring our boys into his house. He's in cahoots with the Russians, and they shoot them when they go in. They've already killed men from the Waffen-SS. Thanks for the warning, said Jungens. As we drove into the village square, the sight of dead German civilians and Waffen-SS men confronted us. Having gathered sufficient intelligence on the extent of the Russian advance, we returned to Jungen's command post, where 2 trucks waited in the yard, engines running. "Check what he's got for us, Unterscharführer," ordered Jungens as the driver brought the Kubelwagen to a halt. "You'll find me in my office when you've completed the inspection." As the Kubelwagen left the scene, I approached the driver of the first truck. "Ammunition?" Yes, ammunition," repeated the driver curtly. I looked under the cover on the back of the first truck. "What idiot sent this? We need machine gun ammunition, not 88mm shells. Wait right here." I went to the command post to report the delivery of the 88mm shells to Jungens, who instructed me to tell the truck drivers to take them back to where they came from. On returning to the farmyard, I found the trucks had already unloaded their cargo into the nearby barn, a building with a timber roof and open sides. "Here," said the driver, thrusting an invoice at me. "Just hurry up, will you sign this?" The trucks left in suspicious haste. As I made my way to Jungen's office to report my concerns, the barn disintegrated in a searing flash. Shards of timber rained down, then a mist of fine dust. One thought ran through my mind: Seydlitz troops. On the 26th of April, a column of Tigers and Panzer IVs belonging to Obersturmbannführer Kausch's Schwere Panzer Abteilung 202 appeared. "Just what we need," said Jungens with a wide smile lighting up his face. "I've been waiting for a chance like this." He strode over to the first tank, a Tiger, to greet the commander, who perched proudly in the open turret. "There's a little matter I would like to deal with," said Jungens. "The Russians are close by in Gutskabe. I'll take command of this tank to lead the attack." The tank commander protested. "This is my tank. We are on our way to Berlin. You have no right to commandeer it." Jungens was having none of it. He climbed onto the Tiger and simply yanked out the commander and set off in the direction of Gutskabe, with my men and me trotting along behind the tanks for protection. As Jungens' Tiger passed through the gate at the entrance of the Gutskabe grounds, there was the metallic thump of steel against steel. Smoke belched from the open turret of Jungens' Tiger. I tried to get to the burning tank, but was turned away by medics whose ambulance seemed to have appeared from thin air at precisely the right moment. Ignoring my demands to accompany my commanding officer, the medics loaded Jungens into the back of the ambulance and whisked him off to the first aid post at our headquarters, where he died soon after arriving. I still had the papers listing Jungens' exploits inside my tunic, and true to my word I burned them, then broke up the ashes until I was certain that even in these not a word could be read.